This is a continuation of a series of videos on Heroku architecture, credential by example. The link to all of the videos is available through a Medium article of the same title. The last material that we covered was, let me get down to it, was about Salesforce integration, and in particular Heroku Connect. We were focused on just getting it up and running and reading data. In this case, we were reading contacts. This time, we're going to add in the ability to write contacts. Right? We're basically enabling bidirectional flow of information between Heroku and Salesforce. And there's a bit of complexity here that we're going to need to cover about external IDs. There's various topics we're going to cover through this practice. So we'll just do it by example. So the first thing we need to do is, I'm going to bring your attention to an article. So if you look at Heroku Connect, and just writing, there's an article that essentially covers most of this material. It's called Writing Data to Salesforce with Heroku Connect. And I'm going to kind of skim through this and kind of highlight on some of the topics. So one of the tricky things, and it's, let's see, oh, I'm not sure, it's buried in here. I'm just going to talk about it since I don't want to obviously read this whole thing right now. So the key here that is not apparent when you first, let me just close all this down so I'm not getting confused. And then we bring up Heroku and look at Heroku Connect real quick. And we can talk about it in the context of this. Connect. And let's look at the objects, the fields that we're mapping right now. Okay. So we're mapping, here we are. So we're mapping ID, which is actually a Salesforce ID. So this ID is actually a Salesforce ID that's generated by Salesforce. It's important to know. We're bringing over created date, is deleted flag, name, and then a modification date. The tricky thing here, though, if you think about when you're creating data on the Heroku side, you don't really have access to this ID because this ID here is actually created by Salesforce. So in fact, if you look at our records right now, well, I don't want to get bogged down on that, but if you look at the data right now that we have in our Postgres database, we have the IDs because we're just reading the data from Salesforce, so all the IDs exist. Now the question is, well, when you create contacts in this case, on the Heroku side, the moment you create them, you don't necessarily have a Salesforce ID. So how do you reference that object when it's not synchronized back? Because this polling is set up to run every, I think it says, I don't know if I have it here, but if I hit edit, it's polling every 10 minutes, right? Let's see, I'm going to edit here. Right, so it's polling, in fact, let me turn this off right here. I don't want to do the accelerated polling for the moment. Let's leave it on regular polling. So every 10 minutes, okay, so every 10 minutes is when data gets pulled down. So let's say if I was doing a bidirectional sync, I would write data to Salesforce, but I may not get the data back for 10 minutes. So in that 10-minute window, how do I refer to contacts? Since I don't have a primary key now, I don't have the, so the answer is we create a different key called external ID, right, that we manage on the Heroku side for records that are created on the Heroku side. So it's important to notice. So if just walk through, give a couple scenarios. For objects that are created in Salesforce, you'll see nulls in external ID because they weren't created externally. Okay, if you create a record, in this case a contact on Heroku, okay, when you first create the record, you don't have a Salesforce ID, so Salesforce ID will be null, and you will set an external ID. And so for the next 10 minutes, until the data comes back down from Salesforce, the only way to refer to that contact is by external ID. And then in about 10 minutes, when the synchronization happens, that record now has both a Salesforce ID and an external ID. Okay? So you have a mixture of data, some of which have no external IDs, some have only external IDs, and some records will have both Salesforce IDs and external IDs. So this adds, so we just need to like kind of walk through that by example and think about how we might write queries against things like that. So there's some complexity just around just saying that. So I think the first step is, let's just walk through it in practice. So that was kind of the theory of external IDs and why they need to exist. But let's go through the practice of actually using them, and it'll sort of form this up in our mind. Okay, so the first step in using external IDs is we need to actually create an external ID. Salesforce, we have to go to Salesforce, right? Because Salesforce owns the schema, essentially, for anything to do with Heroku Connect. This is how we manage the schema. So we go to here, and we go down to Object and Fields. We go to Object Manager. Okay, and in this case, we want to mess around with Contact. Okay, and we want to go to Field and Relationships. Now, it turns out that there's already a field called External Contact ID, and it's 32 characters, which is fine. I think I Googled, when we use the UID library, I Googled it, and it looks like we actually have 36 characters that we need to maintain as external IDs when we use our UUID library. Now, we could change this, but I'm going to go through the exercise of creating a completely new external ID, and just so you see the process of creating one. So I could change this one and move forward since it was already provided for me, but I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to make a new field, and in this case it's going to be a string, okay, so our text, right? And I'm going to hit next. I'm going to call it external ID. Okay. Length, I'm going to make it 36 because UUIDs with the dashes are 36 characters long, not 32. Then it's important you check a couple boxes here. First of all, you need to check do not allow for duplicate values, and it's case insensitive. That's fine. And then we're going to set as a unique record, right? So that's the important, those two flags you need to set, okay? And with that in place, we hit next. And just hit next, next. Okay, so now we have a new ID in our contact object. So now I go back to Heroku Connect. Okay, so let's go here. And now in Heroku Connect, I'm going to refresh the screen real quick. It's going to query for the new field. I should now have an extra field. And I check this box, right? Because I want to start writing to Salesforce, right? And it's saying it's already given you a couple of warnings here. One is you need to select. So in this case, I'm going to use the one I created. Okay. So again, this is now when we write to Salesforce, it's going to treat this external ID as the external ID that Heroku is going to manage for records created on Heroku side. Okay. It's important you set that. I mean, you can't pass through this without telling Heroku that you're using that field in that capacity. Other thing you notice it says it also knows enough about the Salesforce schema to know that last name is a required field. So we're going to go check both first name and last name for good measure. Okay, so that when we create records, we're going to create it with first name, last name, and external IDs. Okay, so and we're going to leave accelerated polling off for now. We'll come back and turn it on in a bit, explore it separately. So I'm going to hit save. So it just resynced the data, right? And I think that's it for that. Okay, so let's do Heroku Connect. Okay, now let's look at the code a little bit. Yeah, we'll look at the database in a minute. Do we want to look at the database now? Let's look at the database real quick, just to orient ourselves real quick. I think this might be worthwhile. Let me go back to, let me connect to the database, and we're going to look at the table right now as it stands before we do any work. So if I go to settings, reveal config variables, grab the database, if I type in PG slide, client, connect to the database, and I do describe the Salesforce contact. Okay, so you can see that we've got important new fields are, we have a first name, last name. We also have this external ID that's 36 characters long. You notice the external ID has a primary key, as well as the Salesforce ID also has a, actually, right, here's the Salesforce ID has a key, and so does external ID. So those are essentially, we're going to not use the auto-generated key that Heroku uses. We're going to rely on either our key we create or Salesforce's ID when we sort of work with this object. Okay, the next thing to look at is the data real quick. So if I do select star from Salesforce, of course that's not, okay, I want to look at, not star, I'm going to do, let's look at I'm going to pay attention to two fields, Salesforce ID and external ID. Okay, so you notice, this is illustrating, all the records so far that we've created or working with in context have been created on Salesforce, and you can see that the Salesforce ID is valid and the external ID is going to be null. And they'll always be null because we created them from Salesforce. Okay, so that was the whole point of looking at this. Okay, now I'm going to quit this for a minute. Let's switch gears. Let's look at some code, and then we'll create some records and look back at the database and just make sure we are oriented properly. Right. So let me go to the code. Cert. Okay. Close down some of the stuff so we don't get distracted. Okay. Now I've already written the code again, and we're just going to walk through it. It's going to be available for download in the repository, right? So luckily, it's not too much code. So the first is package.json. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to add a create and a delete method. And, well, we already have a way of listing out contacts. We're going to add in a create and a delete. When you do the create, we need to pass in JSON. So we need to use a library, in this case it's body parser, to essentially pass in or parse out the JSON and pass it in as an object. So that's what body parser, it's a common library with Express. So we add that. Okay, let's look at server, okay, and see what changes we did here. We brought in body parser, okay. Now, you notice I removed connect and PG. That's because I essentially moved it out to a different file. I moved out basically all the Postgres code out of this into another file just to get it out of the way, right, because it's cluttering up this code. So that's what this is. There's a new, I imported new contacts, which we'll look at in a minute. Here's me removing out the Postgres code and moving it to another file, which we'll look at in a minute. Here's me using the body parser. Here is me bringing in, I moved all the endpoints related to contacts out of this file because it was getting heavy. I moved it out, so that's what that is. I believe, here's me removing contacts from this file. Okay, that's it. So the two files that are new, brand new, are PG and contacts. So let's look at them as new files. So PG, this is just bringing the Postgres code out of the server file. It's just bringing it into its own file. Just a matter of just pulling it out. So that's nothing fancy. Contacts, here you can see basically this is following the same patterns I did with OAuth 2, right? I'm defining a router, defining sort of endpoints specific to this, slash contacts, and then slash, and then, there's a delete operation, okay? So, what is it? So this should be familiar. This is exactly the same code we had previously, just moved to a different file, except for now when I get a contact, not only am I using SFID, I'm also getting the external ID now and first name and last name. So I'm just added those fields because now we're mapping those, right? And I basically spit it out. Posting is pretty straightforward, right? We're going to take in a first name and last name. That's really the main data on a contact, right? At least for our purposes. And I'm going to validate that you really did pass in this. Otherwise, I'm going to give you a 400 error, right? So you have to have a first name and a last name. Then otherwise, I'm going to fail. I create a new external ID using UUID. Okay, and then just for clarity, I'm just defining SFID to be null, right? Because I'm creating it off platform, so I'm going to let Salesforce create the Salesforce ID. And then I basically create a definition of a contact, which is there's an external ID that's got an ID on it. There's a first name, last name, and I'm going to construct the name using first name, last name. Okay, and then the Salesforce ID, which is null. And then basically I write it to the database, and if it succeeds, I just give you back the contact. So that's pretty standard stuff, right? Let's look at delete for a second, and then we'll walk through actually the code and see what it does behind the scenes. So delete, I take in an ID, okay? But here's the tricky thing. Which ID is it? Is it the external ID, or is it the Salesforce ID? Because I may have a reference of an object, and I may have one or the other or both. Okay. In this case, I accept an additional parameter called type, right? Which is basically, in this case, when I try to delete something, I'm going to also ask the user to provide not only the ID, but was the ID you provided a Salesforce ID or an external ID? And so basically, you have to provide that. If you don't, it's going to give you a 400 error. And basically, now I'm basically doing if you notice what I'm doing here is I set the key to be either SFID or external ID, okay, in this format. And then I try to do a delete operation based on that key and that ID, okay? And I get the count, so, and if it didn't find the record to delete, it'll return 0, in which case I give you a 404, which is not found. Otherwise, I just return back basically the ID and type that you sent. So I know that success is that you get back the ID and type that you sent. Okay, so that's basically defining, kind of fixing up the get all the contacts, adding a contact. This is the create, and then a delete operation. So that's it. So let's test this code and make sure it's doing. And then look at the data underneath the hood and see how it's operating. So let's see if I can. So the first thing I need to do is kind of run all this. And remember, from before, the database that we're really running against is our staging database, not because we need to use Heroku Connect, so we can't use our local database. Okay, so let me start up npm run watch ts. Okay, that's the compiler watcher. Let's now run npm1 watch node. Oh, I guess I gotta go to the right folder. And then watch node. Okay, so let's see if wait for this to load. Okay, so at least it loaded. Now, if this doesn't work, I'll have to troubleshoot and then come back. But I'm going to try to go localhost 5000. Okay, so at least the server's running. So does contacts work? Okay, good. So this is contacts. As expected, all the external IDs are null, right? And there's my names, my first name, and last name. So that's all working ideally, right? So let's try another operation. Let's try to create, I'm going to do something though. I'm going to get, actually, oh, I can just refresh this query anytime I want, right? Okay, so let me do the next thing, which is, let me try to create, I'm going to use Postman to do this. I'm going to try to create a contact, which I think I did this earlier. Save myself a little bit of. Hang on. Wow, I was testing a lot yesterday. Oh, here we are. Okay, I think I have a lot of typos in my stuff here. Okay, I'm going to do it. Post, body. Okay, this is the one. Okay, first name. Okay, so let me zoom this if I can. I'm not sure it's really zoomed or not, but okay. So I'm doing a this is. Let me get rid of this one here. Okay, so I'm doing a post to contacts. Okay, so that's one of the endpoints. And I'm passing a content type of application JSON, because that's required. That's body parser will require that. In this case, I'm passing in first name is Susie and last name is Smith. Right? Let's see if this works. Push send. And did it work? I can't, wait. Oh, okay. Okay, so the response was, I got an external ID, I got a null Salesforce ID, first name, Smoothie, right, so that's what I'm expecting. And if I reload here, I should see Susie Smith. Now why? So, I mean, this worked, except for I'm a little surprised to see the Salesforce ID here, because I thought I set my polling to be 10 minutes. So why did this come back? So let's go back to Heroku. Okay, so let's do a little troubleshooting here. Heroku. I mean, it's a good thing we got our data back quickly. I was trying to illustrate that it wouldn't. So let's look at this one more time. Connect. Actually, logs, mappings, contact, edit. Okay, I don't have a, okay, so actually I just learned something myself. So it looks like when I insert the record into Salesforce, at the very moment it inserts it, the callback can immediately know what the Salesforce ID is, because the Salesforce ID gets generated right away, and it actually writes it back in the database. And I don't have to rely on the 10-minute polling to get back the, it is asynchronous, but it's super fast. So that's interesting. I had made the assumption that I would have to turn on accelerate polling to get this behavior. Let's do it again and see if I can catch it in between. So let's see. What I'll do is, I probably won't, because this is going to be all like happening lightning fast, but let's just try it anyway. So let me go to here, and I'm going to create a new record. So where's this? It's above here. I'm going to create a John Doe. Okay, and let me send that and refresh this. Man, it's fast. Okay, so what's happening again is I'm hitting send, and within milliseconds, it's going to Salesforce. Salesforce then is creating the record. When it's creating the record, it's back populating in the Salesforce ID. Okay, so that's a little bit of a surprise, but again, it is what it is. So again, so you can see now, I guess the key here though is, so you have a situation where you have records that are created on Salesforce, you have Salesforce IDs and no external IDs. Here you have records that are created on Heroku with external IDs and Salesforce IDs. And depending on how fast things are syncing, there is an opportunity, but it looks like it's only milliseconds right now, where you could have a record that has just external ID and not a Salesforce ID because there's a timing lag. But it's happening so fast right now we can't see it. Okay. One thing I'll make a note, and then, yeah, let me make one other note, and then we'll talk about relationships. So, okay, so okay, so let me pause for a second. I gotta get my this whole thing this whole fact that it's pulling Salesforce IDs quickly is kind of throwing me off for a second. Give me a second to regroup, and then I'll pick up in a second. So let me go here. Okay, I'm back. One thing, I'm going to make one comment here. If you look at the docs on Heroku Connect, which if I can dig it up, I'll find it here. Heroku, I'm going to make one comment about something that's in their documentation that I think is misleading, or at least not a good practice. And it's strange that they even mention it, but they do. So one of the things that they mention in here is, remember how we were creating our IDs? We were using we're doing it in code with the UUID library, right? And if you look carefully at this, let's see if I can find it. Here we are. So this is where they're talking about creating, using this external ID to create records, right? Or create external IDs. And they specifically mention one possible solution here is to use a feature within Postgres itself, right? Where you can actually generate, there's a function within, you can go into this into Postgres, you could use your client, log into the database, and you can then create triggers essentially, or default values for that, that UID, the external ID, and using a function, right? And which means you're essentially changing the schema of the object, of the table, or the table, right? Now they're actually recommending that as a practice, right? Instead, I just did it in code. The problem with the pattern they're recommending here is if you ever drop an object in your Heroku Connect for whatever reason, let's say you're remapping something. The moment you drop it, it drops the schema, in which case you lose this value, and then you remap it later. You have to remember to go back in and go ahead and set this default, and it's really just fragile because you're going to forget that you did this. So, and I don't like this pattern, so I wouldn't personally recommend it. Instead, I would recommend what I did, which is when you create the record in your code, you actually create the ID in the code. Because when you drop and undrop things in Heroku Connect, your code is still not changed. Your code is still going to create the ID. So that's just one observation. Another thing I wanted to look at real quickly was in Heroku Connect, we can look at a couple things that are interesting. Some troubleshooting tools, and let's see if I can get to it. So where's Heroku Connect here? So one of the things that when you're troubleshooting, what's happening in Heroku Connect, right? One of the things here you can see just some volume data. Now the volume is kind of so small, right? We've been moving only one record at a time, right? So we can see we pulled down 16 records and then we pushed up one record here, right? So that's not that much data. But one thing that's really interesting is there's a feature called logs, right? Again, there's no errors, right? Explorer is interesting where you can actually look at a record and see the history of it. So where's my Susie Smith? Here's my Susie Smith record, right? You can actually see at what time, so I'm just do by contrast. You look at Lloyd Benjamin, you see nothing here. That's because we never pushed any data to Salesforce. This Explorer will show you data about things that you pushed to Salesforce, right? And you can see that we inserted a record, right? And you can see all the values that we provided on that insert, and it tells you exactly when it happened. And just like for John Doe, we can see that. Okay. Now, the next thing we'll do is, let's say, okay, so that's an interesting tool. You can actually look at this. Now, just so you know, in the database, there's also a table called _trigger log, where you can actually kind of get the same raw data. It's a little bit more detailed, and you can basically see every transaction that's being sent to Salesforce. So that's another handy troubleshooting tool. I don't know if let's look at it. I mean, we might as well. Let me see if I have Postgres here. Yeah, okay, so control U. Let's look at it here since we have time. Anyway, we'll look at it anyway. Okay, so select star from Salesforce trigger _trigger log. Let's see. Okay, so of course I can't scroll left and right. So there's basically, you see there's a created date. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do select. I'm not even look at created date. I'm gonna look at. Of course, I can't remember. Here, let me describe the table real quick. I've just forgotten what the fields are. Describe Salesforce _trigger log. Okay. So the one I'm interested is I'm interested in looking at the table name. So what object I'm creating, right? And the old value and new value. So that's what I want to look at that. Okay, so I'm going to do select table name, old, there's a lot of things I'm going to look at here. Okay, I'm going to do this. External ID. Oh, actually, not from contact though, from SIP. What am I looking at here? I'm getting myself confused. I'm sorry. I'm going to look at the table name and the old value and the new value from Salesforce. I'm getting bogged down in this trigger log. Okay. Of course, it's too long to say. Okay, so of course it's too long here, but you can see basically. I'm going to look at. It's hard to see in this view. Okay. So here we are. I was just looking at our log here, right? So you can see what you're looking at, what table was changed, and then you can see that this is me inserting. I think I did some other activity before, by the way, so that's why you're seeing this other stuff. But more recently, I just added 2 records, Susie and John Doe. Earlier, I was deleting a record, so that's why you're seeing this null. This is an example of a delete. Okay. Long story short, it's a really handy table to really start digging into what data is being sent to Salesforce. Okay, I think that's really enough for this. Okay. Let's actually do one more thing, and then we'll talk about relationships real quick. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at is deleting. So let's test our delete feature. So right now, we have both Susie Smith and John Doe. So let me delete John Doe, but I'm going to use it by external ID, and then I'll delete Susie by other Salesforce ID. So if I go to, I'm going to cheat and go to my delete operations. So in this case, I'm sending a delete to contacts, and I'm providing. I copied external ID. So the type here is external ID, and then I provide the ID here, right? And I hit send, and it deleted it. So that should have been John Doe, should now be gone, and there's no John Doe, right? And then I can do a delete if I wanted to delete here, I can delete Susie by Salesforce ID by just changing, oops, by providing a Salesforce ID. But then I need to, if I hit send right now, I'm going to get a 404. But if I do Salesforce ID, boom, it's gone, and now Susie's gone. Okay, so one thing I'm not sure if I talked about, but if you look at the docs on writing to Salesforce, generally there's like a 10-second window where as you write to the database, every 10 seconds or so, Heroku Connect is looking for data to be written, basically in the trigger log, looking for data to be written to Salesforce, and it does it almost immediately. Opposite though, depends on how you've configured it from Salesforce back. Does writes to Salesforce come back? It could be up to 10 minutes. If you check this accelerated polling, it can be within seconds that the data comes down. And the new thing to me again was when you write data to Salesforce, you actually get that Salesforce ID back virtually immediately. Still like that 10-second window where it may not be there, but within 10 seconds it looks like it's there. Okay. The last thing we're going to talk about, there's some nuanced behavior in writing to Salesforce. There's like two things to be potentially concerned about. One is, let's see if I can find it. There's something about relationships. Where's relationships? Okay, so right now we're not writing any relationships between objects, right? We're just writing contacts. It gets a little bit trickier when you have to write, let's say, a contact in, and then you have a child object, let's say, I don't know, telephone numbers or something, right? Say it's a secondary record. And the trouble is when you go to insert, and say you're inserting kind of in the same, within milliseconds of each other, right? When you write the contact record, you don't necessarily have a reference to, you know your external ID, because your database knows that, but at that moment, you don't actually have the Salesforce ID. That's coming back in, let's say 1 second later, right? And you need to have this child record refer back to the contact, but you don't have Salesforce IDs. All you have is external IDs. So long story short, Heroku Connect has a mechanism where it will automatically create, as you have these relationships, it'll automatically create these external related fields, okay, that you can use to make references between objects. And once it gets synchronized, it'll also synchronize, it'll also take the primary keys, the actual Salesforce IDs, and map them for you, okay? Long story short, it's a little bit of complexity. You just got to be careful about relationships, and so I would definitely read about this before you use relationships. Another bit of trickiness, it's somewhat different. See if I can find the section on it. Oh, so there is some little bit of trickiness around timing. It only manifests, and you definitely want to read about this on your own. But when you write to sales, so I think the scenario goes something like this. You write, you have to say you have your contact object, and you create the contact in Heroku side, okay? And then let's say you turn on, right? You turn on accelerated polling. Okay, so you turn on accelerated polling, right? Which means the data should come back pretty quickly. So let's say you do two writes. You create a record, right? And then right after that, you update that record, like in 1 millisecond later, you update maybe the last name of the person, okay? What can happen is that transaction that goes to Salesforce, the first transaction, the create record happens. Salesforce now creates a person, right? And then you write, let's say you update a second later or a couple seconds later, you update that same record. Well, what can happen is Salesforce, when you change the record, Salesforce will come back down and tell you that it wrote this record, and it'll overwrite your update, right? Then the update happens back to Salesforce, and it comes back down again. So there's a concept of data can be, they're talking about Heroku Connect is eventually consistent with Salesforce. there you can get this sort of flip-flopping behavior. And they talk about this as flip-flop behavior, where you write a record, and you immediately update it, and then Salesforce will write it back to what it was, and then within a second or so, your data will now be properly reverted back to the final state. So this is, again, I would definitely read this section. This really only happens when you use accelerated polling, because it's all within seconds. This is all about data flip-flopping within seconds. So it's something to be concerned about if you're using accelerated polling and you're updating your records on the Heroku side really fast within seconds of each other. Okay? Something to just put in the back of your mind, and you have to think about how you might want to mitigate that. So one is not to use accelerated polling, but that's a popular feature. Okay, so this was a little bit rambly, but this was all about writing to Salesforce, the need for external IDs, and then some of the complexities around external IDs with relationships, and some of the nuanced behavior of how Heroku Connect synchronizes with Salesforce. This is definitely a document you will want to read kind of carefully, and to be honest, I've read it multiple times and I'm still sort of digesting it. Right? I have it mostly in my head, but sometimes I have to go reread this again. Okay, that's it for this video.